Now I want to talk about female samurai sexuality, which I certainly want to talk about as separate from, but related to, the institution of marriage. Sex and marriage are just not the same things, but of course, during the Edo period, as elsewhere and as at other times, they are certainly linked. Sexuality, sexual expression, and sexual desire of samurai women was seen as something that needed to be harnessed and used for the house, or it could be destructive. But it was recognized, even by many of these crusty male samurai, that, as they saw it, female sexual urges were, they needed release just as male sexual urges did, or else you might have all sorts of problems with affairs and people cheating on each other all the time. So you did need to have an option for women to do this. And for higher status samurai women, or basically for samurai women who had who felt they had some kind of image to uphold, or whose men felt they kind of had to have people not even think about their women as anything but moral. All of these kinds of urges were taken place of inside the house. And if men were not around to satisfy them, maybe they were off in Edo on their yearly trips, or whatever. Maybe they were on assignment. Maybe they were incapable of satisfying women. Maybe they were impotent. Maybe they were not interested in satisfying their wives' sexual urges because they preferred men. In all sorts of cases where it wasn't just man, woman of the same family, was married into the family, or concubine, having sex. In all other cases, what you did was you basically promoted masturbation for these women. There were sex toys, and there were certain techniques that were supposed to release these sexual urges if the man wasn't around to basically relieve them in the natural way, or, as I've said, if the man was not willing to do that. Now, you may be asking, and I certainly hope you are, because it's a logical question, well, what about female on female sexuality? Well, this is far less well documented excuse me, in the literature, much of which was written by men, and certainly there's plenty of sexual stories, romances, and these shunga prints that do depict women having sex with other women. But if we're talking about relatively reliable historical sources depicting people's actual relationships with each other, that's very scant evidence indeed. Although there's much better evidence for male-on-male sexuality. However, it was present. Women did have sex with other women. It's very difficult to speculate very much on exactly what role it played in samurai society, but it certainly was around and certainly was depicted, as I said, in shunga, in these pornographic erotic prints, in romance novels. People were aware of it. We really do need to understand this problem better. If anybody's very interested in a career in Japanese studies or history, please, by all means, remember that the subject of female-on-female sexuality in early modern Japan it has a lot of promise, and you should really look into studying something like this. And in fact, that's how history works in general. You find an area that you think is interesting, but where a lot of more research needs to be done for us to really understand it, and you kind of plug yourself into it. Samurai women and work. We did talk about this somewhat, in that poorer samurai women had to work. Well, what did they do? Depending on their status, once again, the more status you had, the less free you were to pursue all types of work. But really what you ended up concentrating on were things that you could produce inside your house. Various types of handicrafts. You spun cloth, you created fans, you created umbrellas, that kind of thing. And there were a great many restrictions against women working outside the house. So naturally, this is why many samurai women gravitated to in-house employment, besides issues of honor and face, saving face and status, which were also very important. Many restrictions. For example, women could not be kabuki actresses, despite the fact that kabuki actually kind of was invented by women. There's also a fantastic article, which I'm really sad I could not assign to you, because it's a condensed course, but it basically recounts how kabuki started out, this traditional form of Japanese theater that we now think of, with incredible costumes, with exaggerated gestures, much more lively than No is, for example. It started as a way for brothels to advertise their prostitutes, and the prostitutes did a song and dance number, and then the Bakufu said, you really shouldn't be doing this, that's not okay. So the brothels kind of had a huddle and said, oh, okay, well, we just have to make it look like these women aren't advertising their sexual body, their sexual availability. And so women were then instructed to basically perform plays, and that's where we really get the start of kabuki in its modern form as it's known today. And then the shogun saw right through this, and he said, no, you're really just still advertising sex, you're just pretending it's a play. And then the shogun forbade women from acting in kabuki at all. So now all kabuki actors are male. Which just goes to show you, first of all, the samurai in power were very concerned with regulating relations between the sexes, because a lot of the relations between the sexes had implications for political power in general, but also goes to show you that working outside the home was actually just very difficult for many women, especially samurai women who would never be employed at a brothel. Unless they were willing to throw their family away and probably hide who they were. But if we consider, as I think we really should, homemaking as work, managing all of the household in terms of telling the servants what to do, or if you're lucky enough to have servants as a samurai woman, cooking, cleaning, all sorts of things, organizing your house finances, making sure that everybody in the house has clothes. You really, if you take all of these things into account, you get a picture in early modern Japan as today in the modern United States, that housewives among the samurai class, as everywhere, were really engaged in very demanding unpaid work. So thinking about the engagement of samurai women with the economy and with productive labor, and just with the whole concept of work, I think we should really keep this in mind and recognize the fact that they really did a lot of work, real work, to make society function, samurai society and the wider society of Japan as a whole as well. Women, another interesting aspect of being a woman in early modern Japan, not a fun aspect, was that your physical movement was very often restricted. Now, we've talked about, even if you could, for example, leave your compound, your house, wider forces, the law and norms, gender norms, would still have a lot to say about what you could and could not do and where you could and could not go. So as we've seen, the wives and children, at least by the first wife of daimyo, were very much restricted from moving around, from leaving Edo, that is to say. They could not leave Edo without special permission of the shogun. And this permission could be given, and often was given, but even when women did travel, they had to be accompanied by a man. Certainly samurai women, but this was kind of the expectation for women in general in Japanese society, although women from the lower ranks of society, the lower social orders, certainly had to do what they had to do. The peasant, or the less powerful orders, I mean, peasants had to get to the field. Women peasants were always in the field. So, this was something that was taken much more seriously in relation to samurai women than to women of other social classes, other than aristocrats who just, couldn't leave the palace without the permission of the shogun at all. But if a woman wanted to travel down the Tokaido, for example, that magnificent road from Edo all the way to Kyoto, the main thoroughfare of Japan, she would be confronted by restrictions in movement that in many cases were harsher than restrictions on her male counterparts or co-travelers. Everybody had to have a pass to be on the highway. Everybody had to have a pass to be away from where they usually lived, but as I said, women could never travel alone, and women were often subject to very close physical inspections by authorities. This is a sekisho. It's a gatehouse. It's a very, very well preserved and very painstakingly maintained part of this Tokaido. It's at the town of Hakone. Amazing lake view, truly incredible part of Japan, central Japan. If you get to Japan, you really should go to Hakone. There's a lot of cool stuff there. Also a very interesting sculpture museum. But in any case, what this sekisho is basically a fortified post manned by samurai who are supposed to control the flow of people going east and west on this main road. When women, especially high status women, reached this checkpoint, they were more or less strip searched. People, the daimyo, the Tokugawa, were very concerned that women could be used to smuggle things out, including weapons, money, precious gems. This is a recreation of a woman woman's hair being inspected. These local checkpoints hired old women to do this kind of work, assuming that old women were both women, and thus there was less impropriety in having them check the bodies of other women. But just basically these, this traveler's hair is being combed through. This old woman is looking on behalf of the authorities for things like gems, coins, weapons, small knives in the woman's hair. Just because that was her job. That's what these women were supposed to do. It basically ended up being something akin to a system of legalized harassment. Another very interesting job of these old women at checkpoints was to check if indeed the women who were traveling were women. It's a conception in early modern Japanese culture and medieval Japanese culture that young men are actually look a lot like women, and the hairstyles that people used during those days were arrangeable into many different configurations. Men and women wore their hair differently. People usually had a fair amount of hair to work with. Youths did not shave the tops of their head, their pates, as adult samurai did. In fact, shaving off your forelock was kind of a rite of passage in Japan. So if you were if you appeared to be a young male, there always was a worry that you might be a woman in disguise, that some daimyo might be trying to smuggle out their daughter or whatever. And for that matter, for that reason, these old women who worked at these checkpoints literally had to check if young men had penises or not. And also another reason to employ old women to do this, the thought was that they would not sexually excite these young men. But in general, you get a sense of a government really, really trying to keep close track of who travels along its roads or not, and being, in some ways, especially anxious about women traveling alone. Or, I'm sorry, traveling at all, really, is what it comes down to. However, I think we have to keep in mind that despite me painting this picture of Japan as a very patriarchal society in this time, certainly the samurai society being very patriarchal, it was not all doom and gloom. There were significant ways in which the lives of samurai women were fairly good, and in many ways, when the lives of samurai women during the Edo period were better than the lives of the samurai women during previous periods. As I mentioned, time and time again, and increasingly so for the Edo period, the official reality was the official reality, and there were many ways in which it was mitigated by private compromise and circumstances that were kept inside the house. And it was not uncommon for stories of adultery when they came out. It turned out that, for example, the wife had been having an affair for years. Why? Why for years? Well, because for a long time, in some of these cases, men chose to ignore it. The men of the house chose to ignore it because it would have been shameful. So that's a rather dramatic example. But there were many, many minor ways in which women succeeded in having some kind of control over their lives. Going to the market, for example. Things as small but as meaningful to some people as that. And of course, especially in the home, and especially informally, they could really live in a way that was not completely dictated by Confucian and Buddhist and samurai social norms. As we've mentioned before, divorce was not uncommon. Samurai women, for that reason, were expected to be virgins if they had never married, but if they had married, there was absolutely nothing. There was absolutely no stigma about marrying widows or divorcees. It's just the expression kind of was that, well, for the previous couple, destiny didn't find them, but for this couple, maybe it will. And also, divorce, yeah, you could divorce, but as a woman, you could not do this formally of your own name. You had to get other people involved and to help you. And you also had some expectations about what you would do after you got divorced. Nobody, for example, there was no equivalent of Sex and the City in early modern Japan. Single women did not just go and rent apartments in Edo and go and explore their sexualities, and nothing like that, unless they signed up with a brothel, which, as we've seen, samurai women were usually prevented from doing. But women were expected to go back to the household after they got divorced, or they were expected to enter the monastery. So, marriage, not absolute, not necessarily a trap for life, but it was still a very important decision which was not overturned lightly. Also, samurai women certainly did travel, despite official restrictions. There were all sorts of good official reasons that they could give, the most popular of which became pilgrimage. In this, they were very similar to men, because when men wanted to travel, they often gave the same example as well, or the same reason as well. Religious processions, religious pilgrimages were wonderful opportunities to get out, to see the country, and there were several tourist routes, pilgrimage tourist routes, which really combined the thrill of the road, gambling, prostitution, all sorts of diversions, picnics, things like that, with the actual ability to go to many of these religious places and take them seriously. And actually, this is something that is a feature of Japan today that many foreigners find baffling. The mix of commerce and religion in Japan, where temples, where shrines are very, very comfortable with their status in modern Japan as tourist magnets, as great centers of exchange of money. And this certainly was a feature of Edo Japan as well, and women took advantage of this. Women went on pilgrimage, and even these fearsome checkpoints, there were always ways around checkpoints, always. You're going to be reading Musui's story for next week. In fact, it's a good idea to start it now. It's an entire book. It goes by quickly, though, and it's full of instances of Katsu Kokichi, this samurai, certainly a male, but this samurai just completely ignoring and going through and tricking people at checkpoints in order to travel the country. So this was perhaps not an element of complete social control. And there was also the undeniable fact that during this time period, many samurai women lived better than before. Certainly the threat of random violence had greatly diminished, and there was a certain degree of material comfort that middle and upper samurai women could expect. Many of the very numerous poorer samurai women really struggled during this time period. In fact, the ways in which money and commerce affected poorer samurai is the part of the subject of a later lecture, and a very important consideration for early modern Japan. But for many women, life was better. Life was certainly more secure. And there were, as we've talked about earlier, of course, these legacies of strong warrior women, Empress Jingu and Tomoe Gozen and a few others, and these stories were still told. They were still around. There was still this understanding that women could and did fight. And it was always something in the background that people were aware of, just part of the cultural DNA of the samurai at this point. And of course, and as we've mentioned before, many women read and were culturally, and some of them even politically engaged. We do have some examples of women writing political treatises. We do have examples of women talking to male samurai about ethical issues, excuse me, about economic, excuse me, and political issues, and by no means should we think of women during this time period as ignorant and as kind of kept in the dark by their men. Many of them may have been sidelined from active participation in public society, but many women, especially if they went out of their way to do this, many women were able to engage in the cultural, artistic, and even political life of Japan.